All right, so you send over some fascinating stuff on this guy, Vladimir Bekhterev.
Yeah.
Looks like we've got excerpts from Psyche Azizin,
Hmm.
that's Psyche and Life in English,
Right.
plus some background on his career.
Yeah.
It seems like you're really interested in the idea of objective psychology.
Yeah, that's definitely a fascinating area,
Okay.
especially considering when Bekhterev was doing this work. We're talking the early 1900s,
Yeah.
introspection, like everybody was doing it. But Bekhterev was pushing for something totally different.
It's almost hard to imagine, with all the brain scans and ways that we have to measure what's going on these days,
Right.
that back then just thinking about your thoughts was like the cutting edge. But
Yeah.
Bekhterev, he wasn't buying it.
Not at all. He really saw it as a dead end for like a truly scientific psychology.
Really?
Yeah, he just thought introspection was way too subjective.
Hmm.
It's like everybody's inner experience is different. So
Yeah.
how do you build like a solid objective science on that?
Yeah, I see your point.
Right.
So instead of focusing on these internal subjective experiences,
Yeah,
he went for something much more concrete.
right.
Results.
Reflects that
Exactly, like the knee-jerk reaction.
kind of, but Bekhterev went way beyond like that simple stimulus response model.
Okay.
Over his career, his research went through several distinct phases. He actually identified 5.
5 different phases?
Yeah, and his understanding of reflexes really evolved.
5 periods of research.
Yeah.
That sounds like quite the journey.
It really was. In the beginning, around 1888, he was mostly focused on like the physical aspects of the nervous system.
Okay.
But as his work progressed, he started to kind of zoom out and incorporate social and even collective behaviors into how he was understanding these reflexes.
So he started with the physical
Oh.
and eventually expanded to the social.
Yeah.
For the early 1900s, that's pretty revolutionary.
Oh, absolutely. And to really understand this evolution, I think we need to understand his concept of nervous energy.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Bekhterev thought this energy was like the driving force behind all mental processes, the fuel for our thoughts and actions.
So if this nervous energy is driving everything, how did he actually study it?
Right.
I mean, it's not like he could hook someone up to an fMRI back then.
No, of course not. The technology wasn't there.
Right.
But that didn't stop him. Bekhterev argued that we could study these energy transformations through observable changes in the nervous system.
Like what kind of changes?
Things like muscle contractions, glandular secretions,
Okay.
even subtle changes in breathing patterns.
Wow, so he was really determined to bring scientific rigor to psychology?
Oh yeah, he was all about it. And what's really interesting is that he even applied this framework to
To what?
plants.
Plants?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
No, I'm serious. Bekhterev was really intrigued by the idea of plant sensitivity.
Okay.
He believed that even simple organisms like plants could exhibit like a basic form of consciousness.
Plants having some level of awareness, I mean, that's going to raise some eyebrows.
Oh, for sure.
So what kind of research was he doing with these plants?
Well, he wasn't just speculating.
Okay.
He designed experiments and everything.
Really?
Yeah, he was really looking for what we might call plant behavior. How do they react to their environment?
So he was trying to prove that plants have feelings.
Well, feelings might be a bit strong.
Okay.
But he did observe some curious things, like he noticed that some plants reacted differently to different people.
Like they had preferences?
Well, that was his interpretation.
Wow.
And even he admitted it was pretty radical.
Okay.
He also thought that plants might even have some kind of rudimentary memory for past stimuli.
Wow.
Yeah,
I gotta admit, this plant stuff is pretty wild.
it is fascinating, isn't it?
But how does this fit with his focus on a more scientific approach to psychology?
That's a great question. I think the way to think about it is that Bekhterev was trying to build a framework where behavior, even in plants, could be a window into like underlying psychological processes,
Okay.
no matter how basic those processes might be.
So he's really pushing the boundaries of what we even consider to be conscious.
He really is.
Okay, so let's bring it back to humans for a second.
Sure.
We've been talking about this idea of nervous energy,
Yeah.
but I'm still not really clear on what it actually is. Did he ever really define it?
It is kind of one of those slippery concepts,
Yeah.
hard to pin down exactly. But he described it as like the fundamental energy of the nervous system,
Okay.
the thing that's responsible for everything from our simplest reflexes to our most complex thoughts.
So it's like all mental activity is at its core about these energy transformations in our nervous system.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, this was at a time when scientists were just starting to figure out how the brain works.
Right. No EEGs or fMRs?
Nope, not back then, but Bekhterev was a pioneer in using electrophysiology to study these processes.
Electrophysiology, that sounds pretty high-tech for the early 1900s.
Oh, it was cutting edge. He
Yeah.
was measuring the electrical activity in the nervous system, really trying to get at how the brain works at like a fundamental level. And, it's interesting, even today,
Yeah.
electrophysiology is still a key tool in neuroscience.
So this guy, the energy theorist, was also on the forefront of experimental methods.
He was a real innovator. He even built some of his own devices for measuring physiological responses. Like a real Renaissance man of science.
That's amazing.
But hey, let's go back to those 5 periods of research he outlined. You mentioned it earlier, and I think it's a really important thread to follow.
Okay.
Starting with the purely physical and ending up in the social realm.
Yeah, it feels like he's constantly expanding the definition of what's even relevant to psychology.
Right.
So fill us in on those 5 periods.
All right, so he starts with subjective psychology. This is like the traditional introspective approach, basically just looking inward at your own thoughts and feelings.
Okay, got it.
But then Bekhterev does a complete 180, and he's like, no, we need to focus on something we can actually observe.
Mm.
And that's where objective psychology comes in.
So from looking inward to focusing on the external.
Exactly.
Okay.
Next, we get to psychoreflexology. This is where reflexes really become central.
Okay.
His argument here is that even our most complex behaviors can be understood as chains of these reflexes.
Kind of like a domino effect.
Yeah, like a domino effect, each one triggering the next.
I like that.
And then from there, things get even more interesting with collective reflexology. Now he's looking at how these reflex chains operate not just in individuals, but in groups.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, things like imitation suggestion, even social movements.
So he's gone from individual reflexes to how those same processes play out on a social scale?
That's it. It's huge. He's basically saying that social behavior, even something as complex as a social movement, can be understood through these reflex pathways. Pretty radical idea for the early 1900s.
Mind-blowing. So what about that last period, just reflexology?
This is where he kind of brings it all together. It seems like a culmination of all those earlier phases.
Okay.
He's striving to create like a unified theory of behavior. Yeah, one that encompasses everything from simple knee-jerk reactions to complex social dynamics.
Wow.
And it's all grounded in this objective scientific approach that he's been developing all along.
So he's saying, like, at the root of it all, whether it's like a simple reflex or something as complex as a social movement, it all comes down to these chains of reactions.
That's what he believed. Yeah, truly scientific psychology had to get at that.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is.
Creating a unified theory of behavior.
Oh, for sure. But for Bekhterev, that's what it required. He wasn't satisfied with just describing things. He wanted to be able to explain them to uncover like the underlying mechanisms.
Okay.
And he thought that by really understanding these mechanisms, we could actually like improve ourselves and society as a whole.
So this wasn't just some abstract intellectual exercise for him.
No, not at all.
He actually thought this stuff could have real-world applications.
Oh, absolutely. Bekhterev was convinced that a really scientific understanding of the mind could have huge implications for everything.
For everything. Like what?
Well, like education, medicine, you name it, even social reform.
Wow.
Yeah, he was really interested in trying to address social problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Oh, crime, poverty, even war.
Hmm.
He thought that by understanding like the root causes of these issues,
Okay.
in terms of objective psychology, of course, that we could develop much more effective solutions.
So that's a pretty optimistic view of the power of psychology.
It is. It's almost like he saw psychology as a key to a better future.
Yeah, it kind of is.
It is. And yeah, I think there's something really inspiring about that vision.
Yeah.
It reminds us that science, at its best, isn't just about cold, hard facts. It's about using knowledge to try and make a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, I like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Bekhtérev's objective psychology, is there like a final thought, a nugget of wisdom that we can leave our listener with?
Let me think. I think Bekhterev would probably want you to consider this. He saw the human mind as like this dynamic system,
Okay.
constantly responding to and transforming energy from the environment. And for Bekhterev, this inherent plasticity, this capacity for change, it was like our greatest strength.
Okay.
If we can understand the mechanisms of this transformation, how it all works, he argued that we can really shape our own destinies, both individually and collectively.
So we're not just passively taking in all this stimuli, we're actively shaping our own experiences through these chains of reflex and response.
Exactly. So here's a question for you to ponder.
Okay.
What kind of energy are you putting out into the world? And how is that shaping the reality you experience? Remember, Bekhterev was all about observable behaviors and their impact on the world around us.
That's a great question. And on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Vladimir Bekhterev and his objective psychology.
It was my pleasure.